Okay everyone, so the third part of Unit 2, Higher Biology, Metabolism and Survival is Cellular Respiration. Firstly, we look at the role of ATP, which is what's produced by respiration. Energy-rich compound, which is used to transfer energy to processes in the cell, such as muscular contraction, making proteins and nucleic acids, active transport of molecules, and transmission of nerve impulses, amongst other things. Little experiment here showing you that ATP is actually required for muscle contraction, in this case, where the muscle fibers are presented with different substances, but the only one where the muscle shows contraction is in the presence of ATP. Glucose, of course, when it's broken down in respiration, produces ATP, but this does not happen in the muscle fibers that have been removed. If we look at the structure of ATP, ATP means adenosine triphosphate. It's one adenosine molecule attached to three inorganic phosphate molecules, like so. Now, when energy is released from ATP, it's the bond which combines adenosine diphosphate to the last end phosphate. It's the breaking of that bond which releases the high energy that's carried within the ATP molecule. So if we consider adenosine triphosphate, and here is the high energy bond. When that high energy bond is broken, energy is released, lots of energy is released, creating adenosine diphosphate and an inorganic phosphate molecule. And like we've already said, ATP is used for the transfer of energy within the cell. It's made from catabolic reaction. It can be made from catabolic reactions such as respiration, but it's used in anabolic pathways. For example, glucose and oxygen gets broken down into carbon dioxide and water. This is aerobic respiration and produces ATP. That ATP, the energy within the ATP, can be used in anabolic processes such as synthesizing proteins from amino acids. In the body cells, there's a rapid turnover of ATP. If too much ATP is existing in the cells at any particular time, sets up a concentration gradient which can draw water into the cells by osmosis. So there's only about 50 grams ATP in the body at any given point. ATP can be used to phosphorylate compounds to give them higher energy, make them more reactive. For example, at the very beginning of respiration, glucose is phosphorylated to become glucose 6-phosphate using an ATP molecule, and this is known as energy investment. So now let us have a look at the stages in aerobic respiration. The first stage being glycolysis. It takes place in the cytoplasm, and glucose is broken down into pyruvate. It involves many enzyme controlled steps. It begins with an energy investment phase in which ATP is used to phosphorylate compounds, and it's then followed by an energy payoff phase where ATP is then produced. So, for example, this is the energy investment phase. A couple of times ATP is used to phosphorylate compounds, so 2 ATP molecules are used up per glucose molecule. The second part of the reaction is where ATP is produced. 4 ATP molecules are produced as that intermediate compound becomes pyruvate. This is the energy investment phase, and this is the energy payoff phase. So, stage 1, phosphorylation of glucose to produce an intermediate that can follow other metabolic pathways. Stage 3 here, this is an irreversible step leading to the rest of the glycolytic pathway producing pyruvate. So 2 ATP are used at the beginning of glycolysis, but 4 ATP are produced. So that's an overall net gain of 2 ATP from glycolysis. Now, During the energy payoff phase, the hydrogen ions and the electrons released from the substrate by dehydrogenase enzymes, and these are then passed, the hydrogen ions and the electrons are passed to what's called a coenzyme called NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. You don't need to remember the name of it, you can just call it NAD. But NAD, when it picks up the hydrogen and the electrons, becomes NADH. Now, glycolysis itself doesn't need oxygen. However, the rest of towards the end of respiration in the electron transport chain, as we'll see later on, NADH will be used to generate ATP, but only if oxygen is present. And if there's no oxygen present, then fermentation occurs, and essentially respiration stops at the end of glycolysis. The second part of respiration is the citric acid cycle that now takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. Now, the beginning of the citric acid cycle, each pyruvate, remember there's going to be 2 pyruvates produced per glucose molecule. Each of these is broken down into a 2-carbon acetyl group, and the molecule carbon dioxide is released. The acetyl group combines with a coenzyme A to form acetyl coenzyme A. And once again, during this stage, hydrogen ions and electrons are released from the substrate, and these bind with NAD to form NADH. So if we have a look at a diagram representing that, there's the pyruvate being broken down. Carbon dioxide is released, so 3-carbon pyruvate becomes 2-carbon acetyl group, which combines with coenzyme A, which is recycled. NAD picks up hydrogen and electrons to become NADH, and that 2-carbon acetyl coenzyme A enters the first stage of what's called the citric acid cycle. The 2-carbon acetyl group combines with the 4-carbon oxaloacetate here to form 6-carbon citrate. Now, at 3 points in the citric acid cycle, 3 NADH molecules are produced, as once again dehydrogenase enzyme release hydrogen ions and electrons from the metabolic substrates in those many enzyme controlled steps of the citric acid cycle. 2 molecules of carbon dioxide are produced, and a molecule of ATP is also produced. Okay, what follows the citric acid cycle is the last part of aerobic respiration, the third part, the electron transport chain. Now, this involves a bunch of proteins on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, which are called cytochromes. And what happens? NADH from both glycolysis and the citric acid cycles, this is where they release their electrons and their hydrogen ions. Now, as the electrons are passed along the cytochrome chain, the electron transfer chain, they lose energy, and the energy is used to pump hydrogen ions from the matrix of the mitochondria, which is where the citric acid cycle took place, across the inner membrane into the intermembrane space of the mitochondria, and so builds up a high concentration of hydrogen ions in that intermembrane space. What happens then? These hydrogen ions are allowed to return back into the matrix of the mitochondria, but through ATP synthase enzymes. Okay, and in that process, the ATP synthase generates lots and lots of ATP. Most of the ATP from aerobic respiration is produced in this way. Those electrons, once they've reached that end of the chain, they combine with oxygen and those hydrogen ions to form water, and that is essentially the end of the process. So, the picture of a typical mitochondrion, it's a double membrane, there's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. The folds of the inner membrane are called cristae, and that's where the electron transport chain takes place. Of course, the citric acid cycle took place in the open space in the very middle of the mitochondria, which is the matrix. So we look at the process of the electron transport chain. We have the NAD comes along, and it releases its hydrogen ions and its electrons, the flow of electrons indicated by the purple arrow. So the electrons are passed along the cytochromes in the electron transport chain itself, and in that process hydrogen ions are pumped across the membrane to the intermembrane space. Those hydrogen ions are allowed to diffuse back through the inner mitochondrial membrane, but via ATP synthase, and the ATP synthase produces ATP as a result. Those energies, those electrons, they lose energy rather, and they combine with the hydrogen ions and with oxygen to produce the water molecules. So most of the ATP from aerobic respiration is produced in this way, and this is essentially the end of aerobic respiration. If, however, respiration occurs without oxygen, this is called fermentation. In plants, carbon dioxide is lost as part of the process, and this produces alcohol. Now, because the 3 carbon pyruvate molecules are broken down into 2 carbon alcohol and 1 carbon dioxide molecules, as the carbon dioxide is lost, it's an irreversible process. However, fermentation or anaerobic respiration in animal cells and some bacteria, in muscle cells, particularly in animals during strenuous exercise, glucose broken down into pyruvate, and what happens is, in the absence of oxygen, lactate is produced. Now this builds up what's called an oxygen debt. The lactate causes cramp in the muscle cells if it remains there, or continue to cause cramp. So after exercise is finished, extra heavy breathing provides those muscles with the oxygen required to convert that lactate back into pyruvate, which can then follow the normal aerobic respiration pathway. If we just look at the total yields of ATP for both types of respiration and fermentation, like I said before, fermentation is essentially glycolysis. Pyruvate is the end of that pathway, which forms alcohol and carbon dioxide in plant cells, or yeast cells even, but it can form, the pyruvate can be converted to lactic acid or lactate in animal cells or bacterial cells. It only produces 2 ATP. Aerobic respiration, the full aerobic respiration pathway, can produce 38 ATP molecules, however. But cells will respire aerobically, only resort to fermentation when it's absolutely necessary. Okay, thank you very much.